The popular view of the Great War of 1914 to 1918. Waves of foot soldiers going over the top, out from their trenches into no man's land and a hail of machine gun fire. But for most of the time, trench warfare on the Western Front was a much more static affair. Only the select members of the new Royal Flying Corps, later rechristened the Royal Air Force, were free to rise high above the battlefield. In their fragile aircraft of wood, wire and fabric, they fought the enemy in single combat and at close range. Among the new inventions appearing on the battlefield was the cine camera. It was big and heavy and had to be cranked by hand, but it captured a vivid record of events. For the first time in history, audiences at home could share in the experience of war. This program uses the film and sound archives of the Imperial War Museum to create a first-hand impression of life and death on the Western Front.
Everybody knew that the war would be over by Christmas.
It's going to be over in 6 months. That was the impression generally. And these people thought that they were going to out there and help finish it off. And they were not downhearted or anything like that.
The sergeant said, "Are you willing to join?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "How old are you?" I said, "I'm 18 and 1 month." He said, "Do you mean 19 and 1 month?" So I thought a moment. I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Right, I will sign here, please." He said, "You realise you can go overseas?"
Sort of looked at it as a sport, as if we were going out big game hunting.
We watched you playing cricket and every kind of game. At football, golf and polo, you men have made your name. But now your country calls you to play your part in war. And no matter what befalls you, we will love you all the more. So come and join the forces as your fathers did before. Oh, we don't want to lose you, but we think you ought to go. For your king and your country both need you so. We shall want you and miss you, but with all our might and main, we shall cheer you, thank you, kiss you, when you come home again.
Whereas the soldier was looked down in peacetime, he looked down on, and then tolerated at other times. At times like that, he was heroic. Nobody could do enough for him.
The main thing was, at that time, to try and get out to France. Everybody wanted to get out.
We had two bands with us. We had a pipe band of 8 pipers, and we had a brass band. We could march miles out behind the pipers.
When we went to France, I think they thought they were going on that fortnight's holiday.
You were never told where you were heading for. The only thing was that you knew that you were travelling east.
We had to go out and reconnoitre this village down in the valley, and if there was no opposition, or very little opposition, we had to go through and dig in on the other side.
About a yard in front of the trench, you throw your earth there, and you would dig down about 4 feet. You call the back of the trench the paradox. You call the front of the trench the parapet. On the paradox side, you would dig down for another 18 inches to 2 feet, thus leaving a shelf which was called the fire step. The trenches, to the uninitiated, were a maze. But the guide, he took us into the communication trench, which passed through the support line, the reserve line, and into the front line.
And there was a duck board laid in the bottom to keep you off the soil with wet and the weather and that sort of thing. Everybody walked along the duck board, one behind the other. That's the way you went into line. The first man, he would say, wire overhead, hurling the duck board, and that message come all the way down. As every man came up, it was passed back, so you knew what to expect.
The front line consisted of bays of about 10 yards in length, and then there would be a traverse, and then another bay, and so on, right the way along. Each bay would hold 3 men. At night time, those 3 men would be close together, one standing up, looking over the top. He was sentry. The next man would be sitting next to him, close up to his leg, so that if anything happened, the sentry could just kick the man next to him, and they would both get up together and have another look. And the third man was allowed to lie out on the fire step and sleep.
The width of no man's land varied quite considerably. Sometimes you never see a sign of Jerry. Another time you could hear him. He didn't show himself much any more than we did. It was a question of keeping your head down again, and if you did spot anything, then you would open fire. Jerry was very alert. That's how I always found him anyway when I was with the lads, and obviously self-preservation was the first instinct.
A battlefield is one of the most desolate looking places in the world. As you look through your periscope, all you could see was the devastated land of no man's land, the hundreds of shell holes, the bar of your barbed wire, yet you never saw a sign of life. And yet, you knew very well that within shouting range there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of men.
You've got to remember that the pre-1914 British Army was largely a social institution, and regiments were largely clubs. Only a minority of personnel considered themselves professional soldiers. I went to France at the end of October 1914 as a subaltern to the 3rd Hussars. We were constantly employed as dismounted cavalry to take over trench lines, usually for a short time before infantry became available.
I had a bit of an inclination towards Bengal lancers or something of that kind. But there was a noise overhead, an unusual noise overhead, and everybody rushed out to have a look. And there, going overhead, was an aeroplane. I always have been very, very keen about this flying business. And so from there all the way home, my mind ticked over on a thing which I'd heard about, which was called the Royal Flying Corps.
A circular came round all cavalry divisions asking for lightweight, specified lightweight officers to volunteer to become observers.
The Royal Flying Corps was a very exclusive corps that frightfully hand-picked people in it, and the only people who could get into the Royal Flying Corps were people who were seconded from the regular regiments, and not only that, from the better class of the regular regiments. And so that was that. But I did pick up from the chap. Did I know anything about airplanes? I had to admit that I didn't. If I had known something about airplanes, they might have had two thoughts about it.
In those days, unless you were an officer, you weren't supposed to have sufficient brains to be capable of flying. it was sort of a closed shop, because it was only the officer class who could pay for his private tuition and civil life. It was simply a question of class.
It was an agreeable coincidence that my first commanding officer and the first two pilots I flew with were all three Old Etonians.
The other regiments, they knew very little about us, but when they found that our pay was much higher than them, they were a little bit jealous.
The cavalry tended to be jealous of a new arm that might detract from their reconnaissance potential. I was moving away from an arm which was obviously having minimal active service, and that under conditions of gross discomfort.
If old Jerry shells the trench, never mind. If old Jerry shells the trench, never mind. Though the blasted sandbags fly, you have only once to die. If old Jerry shells the trench, never mind.
E com vocês, mais sucesso da banda Podre!
Sou governador, caboclo seringueiro, discurso de ator, lobo e pele de cordeiro.
Half an hour before dawn, everybody in the front line stood to. The sentries would be now, as soon as it became dawn, would be looking through periscopes. But everybody would stand to. That is, they were prepared in case there was an attack, because the favourite times for attack was dawn or dusk.
The weariness of all day long keeping your eye on that periscope, because you couldn't put a finger up, never mind your head. We did have some young chaps. Well, it seemed funny for me to talk about young chaps, although I was only 18. But the first thing one young chap did, he jumped on the fire step and looked across, and he didn't see anything. He was hit through the forehead and dead as a heron before he'd been there 3 seconds.
I've opened fire in the early morning stand too at some bushes that were waving about in the mist, and they looked like Jerry. In fact, Sergeant come up to me and said, "Who the bloody hell was that firing?" And so I said, "It was me, Sergeant." So he said, "What are you firing at?" I said, "I could see something over there." I said, and he had a look over the top, and he said, "Oh Christ," he said, "that's bushes there, it's been there all the time."
After stand 2, there would be perhaps 2 or 3 sentry groups in the whole company's front, and the rest of the men would see about having their breakfast.
People in England thought you were fed on the best, but to my opinion is the nearer you got to the enemy, the less you got. You were paid less, and the food came through too many people's hands before it got to you. And often, when you woke up, there would be a tin of biscuits in the middle of the billet. And when that was your lot.
Sometimes you just had hard biscuits. They said there were meat in them. I eat a lot because I had good teeth, but the poor fellas that couldn't. You could always get an abundance. And you could always get an abundance of cheese, Canadian red cheddar. And they had what they called tickler's jam. And you could get plenty of that. You'd open a tin of that and spread it on the cheese and eat it. No bread, so you eat that. Tickler's jam, well known in First War.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got bags of Tickler's jam? As soon as Reveille is heard, we never get out to bed. Oh, we never get up till the sergeant brings our breakfast up in bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got bags of Tickler's jam? Halt, right, left, turn. What do we do with the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. One of the things that you would find in every bay was a miniature fireplace. Always on the reverse side, on the Parado side of the trench, was a little fireplace where you used to have a brew up. Each man prepared his own breakfast. He'd already drawn his water from the sergeant. You put that on the hobs, and then you would light your chips of firewood under there and boil your water. When the water was boiling, you put your tea and sugar in that.
Often as not, a shell would come over and a great lump of dirt would come down, bang, and away goes your tea.
You always left a little of your tea, and you would dip your corner of your towel in the tea and wipe round your face, and that was your morning ablution. Then there's a little tiny drop of tea still left, and you put your shaving brush in that, and you would lather your face, and you would have your shave, because we had to shave in the front line. Otherwise, especially the dark chaps, would look like brigands.
It was primitive. You had to do best you could and where you could and how you could.
But then, of course, you accepted it. Makes all the difference in the world. You knew what you were there for, you see, and that sort of thing.
We are Fred Carnot's army, Fred Carnot's infantry. We cannot fight, we cannot shoot, what goddamn use are we? And when we get to Berlin, the Kaiser he will say, Hoch, hoch, mein Gott, what a bloody fine lot Fred Carnot sent today.
There's nobody could keep clean in that war. It doesn't matter who the war, eventually your blankets were infested. In any place that you went into in the line, any hole or anything, it was there. It was all lice and all that sort of thing, like in the book.
The favourite way of getting rid of the lice was to have a lighted candle. You would take your trousers off, turn them inside out, and you would run the seams of your trousers over the lighted candle, and you could hear the eggs going pop, 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 pop. You would put your trousers on, but the next day you had just as many lice.
There was rats there, well, I wouldn't say big as cats, but big as kittens. They were enormous size. You've never seen any rats in England like it. Great big rats. They used to feed on anything we threw away, or garbage or whatever it was there, and bodies, if you like to put it that way, because there was plenty of that about, you know.
There was always a repair job to be done. You see, the trenches, especially in wet weather, the sides were always giving way.
Deep dugouts were mostly German. But ours was smaller. And you used to dig yourself what they call a foxhole.
It wasn't until we captured the German lines that we knew what real dugouts were. We came across dugouts that were 30 feet deep, and you could shell them till the cows came home and they would laugh at it.
It's like as if our side was only there temporarily to go on, and the Jerry's was dug to stop.
When we were relieved, we'd be marched back to billets. First thing you would do would be to flop down and go to sleep. The next morning would be devoted to cleaning your rifle, and then cleaning yourself, because you were always muddy or dirty. You'd brush your clothes or dry them off the best way you could, clean your boots, in other words, smarten yourself up.
If there was any villages around, that was where you went down, and that's where you bedded down.
And that was where most of these boys learnt a little more about life than they would ever have done in normal civil life. Every town of any size at all had its house of entertainment, which I believe is called a brothel. So people gathered, although they were young in years, it wasn't long before they were quite worldly wise men.
Oh soldier, will you marry me? Oh no, my pretty fair maid, that never can be. For I've a wife at home in my own country, 2 wives and the army's too many for me.
The only time we saw the artillery was when we was out at rest. And you knew where their gun pits were, because when you were coming out the line, perhaps they opened up and fired off a salvo.
They had these 30 hundredweight 6-inch howitzers, which were drawn by 8 beautiful shire horses apiece.
This chap was connected with a telephone landline, dot-dash, Morse code. And he'd give the instructions what range and what aiming point, and then he'd check on where that shell dropped. He'd give it a command and then tell you, load up. You put the white bag in, then the red bag, then they close the breech, then the lever dropped. That was where the hammer hit it. That fired it. Deafening. We used to stuff all sorts in his ears, because you got the full blast of it. If you stood in way of it, it'd knock you out. But they were heavy to carry. The shells were different colours for different things. The blue, red and yellow, I think it was, the 3. The shrapnel, percussion and high explosive, TNT. We had to do the donkey work. It was just a matter of passing, pushing in, fired, but as he opened it, he threw the case out, you put another, give him another, and he threw it in. Like clockwork. We were in our little group here, and the other little group was over there. We're friendly enemies, each one. We were always in competition with one another. We were young, we couldn't, we were excited. We had to fire one every minute, and you'd go on, we're giving him a go on that attitude, you see. It was a pleasure, actually.
I knew what war was like. I had seen death, too much of it. And also I did know that flying, it would soon be over if you'd come to the end of your life. You didn't have to sleep in mud, night after night, day after day. But I think the main reason was that I very much wanted to fly.
Our training was pretty sketchy, because after all, at that period, everything, including flying, was frightfully experimental and tentative.
There, for the first time, I really saw an aeroplane, close to, handled it, touched it, and all that sort of thing. We had a proper dual control machine which had the complete controls in the pupil's seat, and during the course of instruction one had a certain amount of instruction in the dual control machine and a certain amount of instruction in the non-dual control machine.
There was a fitter and a rigger on each aircraft who worked on that aircraft alone, and then we used to go down to the workshops and be trained in rigging and sail making, and those who were for engines used to go to the engine shops and had training on the engines. The formula for starting up an aircraft was very precise. You got the officer in the cockpit, and when he was ready you would say to him, petrol on, switch off, suck in. Well, then you'd turn the propeller a few times so as to get a charge into the cylinders of the engine, and you would say to him, contact, sir. He would answer, contact, and he would switch the thing into contact. And then you'd hold it with two hands and give it a tremendous swing. And if it fired, that was all right. It would start to run and you'd get clear of it and stand by the chocks. And when he waved his hand, you would pull the chocks away and you knew that he was ready to take off.
Engine failure taking off was one of the great causes of casualties. People tended to try and turn back and didn't put their noses far enough down to get a gliding angle and sidestepped or spun and crashed into the ground.
I can remember every minute of that flight. It took off, the engine sort of struggling to get up into the air, and then the pilot throttled back a little and flattened out, and it went smoothly. And then when he took a turn, a sharp turn, and I could see the ground, and I looked up vertically and I could see the sky. And then we went round and it seemed as though across the nose of the plane that the world was whizzing round until he flattened out and went straight again. I don't know, there was a terrific thrill to me, the feeling of the plane being flown around.
Eventually I did my first solo, which was a terrifying experience, and only after Struggler had left me alone in the machine did I realize that I knew nothing at all about it, and I didn't even know what the controls did. As I was gliding in over the AID sheds onto the aerodrome, I found that I was undershooting. In other words, I was going to hit one of the hangars instead of getting over them. So in my panic, I did what I shouldn't have done. I jammed open the throttle suddenly, but the Lord being on my side, the engine picked up, and I bounced up over that shed. I landed, the undercarriage collapsed, and down I went. It was a bad show to have crashed an aircraft.
Major Higgins came running across and he said something like, if you want to kill yourself, you can, but don't kill one of my men.
Isso aqui, ó. Imagina esse material lá na praia. O foco principal é o meio ambiente e está gerando trabalho e renda para as pessoas, porque um homem hoje sem um trabalho ele não é nada. E através da reciclagem a gente está resgatando vidas com esse grupo que tem. Vocês veem esse resultado aí, imaginam o dobro.
I bought from the local pack of harriers in Sussex 4 couple of hounds. These I took out with me to France. I hunted hare with a most distinguished field, beautifully mounted on their first chargers.
I was told I'd be posted to number 5 squadron, and a tender was being sent out for me to take me up there. As we drove on and on, more east, I wondered whether we were going through the lines. But France was a bigger country than I imagined, and eventually we arrived. The duties of the squadron were artillery observation, which was the A and C flight, and offensive patrols, which was the Vickers fighter.
We had no distinguishing marks on our aircraft. Now the Germans hit on a very good plan for marking theirs. They had a big black cross on a white ground, and we had nothing. So our infantry and other soldiers, if there was an aircraft came too low over their trenches, they'd fire at it, whether it was British or German. They did a lot of damage that way, and something had to be done about it. And then we tried to decide on some kind of a mark for our own. Well, the first thing was to put a Union Jack on. They painted Union Jacks on the underneath of the plane and flew up with it, and that just looked like a smudge. And then we painted the target, as we used to call it, what they call the roundel now, and the aircraft was sent up, and the staff officers decided that was a good thing. But while that was going on, we actually sent some men from the Royal Flying Corps into the trenches, and if an aircraft came over, that man would tell the commander of the platoon whether it was German or English.
Bomb last night and bombed the night before. Going to be bombed tonight if we never get bombed anymore. When we're bombed, we're scared as we can be. God strafe the bombing men from higher Germany. They're over us, they're over us. One shell hole for just the four of us. Thank you, lucky stars, there are no more of us. 'Cause one of us could feel it all alone.
Trench mortars, the accuracy of them was simply out of this world. They knew to an inch where our trenches were. At night time you couldn't judge where they were coming, and you got to stand there and you just prayed.
You can't say you was terrified when you get past that. The point is, when the war's on like that, the whole mentality of your body is so geared to take what's coming and put up with it. That's why discipline is so essential to any army, because if you hadn't got discipline, men would simply jump over the top and run away, wouldn't they?
Send for the boys of the Girls' Brigade to set old England free. Send for me brother, me sister or me mother, but for God's sake don't send me.
A feature that struck me and left an impression on my mind was when we got rookies up and the first barrage, they were terrified. I've seen them laying down in the trench calling out for their mother. Once you got over the first barrage and you were still there, you didn't bother anymore. You knew your lives were in one another's hands, and it united you very closely, and you didn't let anything interfere with that, I think.
Oh, I had a couple of pals with Yorkshire lads. We just shared everything.
That was the true comradeship. But what amuses me sometimes are people using the word comrade now when they don't know the meaning of it. And the only comradeship I ever knew was in the trenches, and when we shared everything we had with each other. When you had pals and you built up a little comradeship, one of us got knocked out, or a couple of us, and then that was when we felt the war was really hitting us, you know. wasn't what the Germans were doing to us generally, or we were doing to the Germans. If our mates, we lost our mates that was together.
They were both killed. One died of wounds and the other one was blown to bits.
Far, far from Wipers I long to be, where German snipers can't get at me. Damp is my dugout, cold are my feet, waiting for whiz bangs to send me to sleep.
The winter of 1916-17 was notoriously a very, very cold winter. I think I almost in my own mind then tasted the depths of misery, really, what with the cold and all that sort of thing, you see.
Yes, indeed. We never expected the mud, blood and shit that we'd got to put up with. Oh, the lousiness and dirtiness.
When you got back into ports, almost every morning, every man had to take his boots and socks off and rub his feet with whale oil. And that was supposed to combat the malady known then as trench feet.
Whale oil was a lubricant which repelled water. But if you know, your feet used to get, like they used to have years ago, washing clothes, and your hands all get wrinkled with water and soap. Well, your feet used to get like that through being encased in water.
It rained all the time until we got into the front line.
Oh, dreadful. Dreadful.
From then on, it froze.
It filled the trenches up. We were throwing the snow out, and the drifts were blowing it back in as fast as we were throwing it out, and the Germans were doing likewise.
Not a shot was fired in those 4 days on either side. Of course, I don't think there was a rifle on either side would have fired.
Think of me crouching where the worms creep, waiting for Sergeant to sing me to sleep.
We used to write letters in the dugouts.
Yeah, they always had some field cards, just like a postcard. And everything was written on there. You didn't need to write a letter. I am quite well. I have received your letter. I have received your parcel. I have been wounded. And all you did was to cross out the ones you didn't want.
It was censored anyway. It would have been scrubbed out, I think.
Your very existence was different to anything you'd experienced before. And the only thing you could speak to your comrades and they understood, but the civilians, it was just a waste of time.
There's a long, long trail winding into the land of my dreams, where the nightingales are singing under pale moonbeams. There's a long, long night awaiting until my dreams all come true, till the day that I'll be going down that long, long trail with you.
We could all sing. I think that was a real thing that kept us together more than anything. I got knocked off for singing in the front line because I was happy-go-lucky, and I didn't care. And the officer who was defending me was asked, "What have you got to say in Gilman's defence?" And he said, "Cheerful under all circumstances, sir."
We did get a rum ration.
Oh, I used to take the rum ration, yes. It was powerful stuff. Kill you if you had plenty. It was really a medicine against the wet. You only got it in the winter, you know.
If the sergeant steals your rum, never mind. If the sergeant steals your rum, never mind. Though he's just a bloody sot, let him take the bleeding lot. If the sergeant steals your rum, never mind.
In the flying corps, we had fires in the anteroom, and we were comfortable. And as a matter of fact, we were as well off as we should have been in England. As an ex-infantryman, all the time I think I was thinking of the infantry during that terrible weather. But when I left, my brother officer said, "Good heavens, haven't you seen enough planes come down in flames?" I said, "Yes, but haven't you seen enough death in trenches?"
All the men who were actually working on aircraft were held before the commander. And he said something like this. He said, "You men must guard these aircraft with your lives. Without these aircraft, the army is blind. We are the eyes of the army. And if it's between you and the aircraft comes first. We've got plenty of men, but we can't get aircraft."
It certainly paid a pilot to listen, because he flew entirely from the ear. And after I had flown with these engines, something over 12 months, I could tell whether that thing is missing because the mixture was too rich, or that a plug had cut out, or a rocker arm had broken.
From the moment he took off, the pilot never looked at his instrument again. Never. He went by the feel on the joystick, the feel on his feet, and the wind on his face. It was all manual, which was one reason why people who had been good horsemen tended to be good pilots. The same delicacy of touch on the controls, as opposed to a grab or a job in the mouth on a horse, was what made for good and pleasant flying.
Our enemy was the Fokker. And the one thing about the Fokker was it had a ceiling which was so high that it left every RFC aeroplane standing like a goldfish in a bowl with its nose up and not getting up at all. We could not reach it. And the system was to get up high and wait. And when it was up at about, say, 17 or 18,000 feet, we would come waffling along at about 10, and they would then dive down on our bombers.
For the first time in centuries, we entered again an era of individual combat.
You get underneath the other fellow's tail, because with his guns placed as they were, he couldn't hit you, but you could have written your initials with your gun on the bottom of his fuselage.
We had no conception then at what close ranges it was necessary to shoot to have any effect at all. In fact, we later on learnt that effective range was 50 yards.
There was a sort of code, I think, merely between flying people, whether they were German or British. I had a flight commander who was shot down in flames, but 2 days afterwards a German airplane came over, dropped a message bag, and told us that the gallant Captain Pike was shot down in mortal combat and has been buried behind our lines with full military honors.
Apresentando o novo Moto G. Um smartphone incrível não deve ser um luxo. Deve ser uma escolha para todos. Novo Moto G. Smartphone incrível, preço surpreendente.
The most difficult duty of a squadron commander, I found, was on the many occasions one had to write to the next of kin to advise them of the death of their sons. That was a horrifying thing for a boy of 21 to have to do it.
The men in the trenches used to be sorry for the men who were up above, with no means of sheltering from bullets and shells, and quite vulnerable, where on our part we were sorry for the infantry floundered about in the mud in their trenches.
The devastation was beyond words. I mean, to say all round Passchendaele and places like that, was absolutely, I shouldn't think they could do any more to blowing the country to blazes. It was just a matter of shallows, and no trenches. It was just a matter of occupying a shallow. I was on Landsmark Station. That was blown to, well, blazes everywhere. All the places, platforms, everything, all blown upside down, but I had a machine gun post on Landsmark Station. That was on the Passchendaele front, which was one of the most dreadful places I think I ever was in. Passchendaele.
I want to go home. I want to go home. Whiz-bang Jack Johnson's cold boxes, oh Lord. Don't want to go to the trenches no more. Send me over the sea, where the Alliman can't shoot at me. Oh my, I don't want to die. I want to go home.
It was a lot of sacrifice, that's all it was. These generals that we had was just the same as the German generals. All they thought about was sending extra men in. They didn't care.
I disagreed entirely with the actual conduct of the higher command of throwing lives away for nothing.
Most of the officers I found in my experience relied mainly on the sergeants. They were really the people who carried the war through, I think, sergeants and the sergeant majors.
I always thought the men that carried the British Army was the NCOs and the old soldiers.
I was one of those that if I was told to do anything, I just did it, and that was the end of it.
Some general, about 30 miles behind the line, wanted to know who was on the opposite side. And he would send up a message, raid so-and-so and get prisoners, just like that. He ought to have had the job himself. To send a raiding party over to the German line there was just sending men to death. The same words applied to the Germans. By the way, they were the first Germans I saw on the Western Front, and that would be about 6 weeks or 2 months after we'd been in the trenches. And they were two men who were captured on the patrol. And they were the first German soldiers I ever saw. Perhaps 100 men would have to take part in this raid. And perhaps a whole division of artillery would put down a barrage onto their wire to smash their wire down. Oh God, men just hated it. They didn't mind going over the top, with a fair chance. But by putting this box barrels down, you were sending an open postcard to the Germans to say, we're going to raid that bit there. The consequence was the Germans used to absolutely pour they used to throw everything behind the kitchen stove at you. Open fire with trench mortars, Minenwerfers, light guns, heavy guns, the lot.
9.2s. They were the heaviest we knew about, and they were murderous things, and they had a terrific explosion. It used to break up into splinters about the size of my hand. That was one of those that sliced my mate's head off alongside of me.
It was frustration, I think, more than anything, that they'd lost so many people and made so little ground, and they were starting to wonder why. But there was no feeling of giving up in them. They were just wondering why. And when you came out into billets, you saw these endless lines of walking wounded and ambulances, and you wondered how long we could exist. It was that sort of thing.
Everyone carried a field dressing on them. Everyone in the regiment. And they either put it on themselves, they were wounded, or put it on a companion. That was the first line of treatment they ever got. And then the stretcher bearers took them over, and then they brought them in as quickly as they could to the first aid post that I made in a dugout just 50 yards behind the trenches, actually. And there we did the best we could to them, stopping hemorrhages and that sort of thing.
A lot more men died between being wounded and getting to a casualty clearing station or a base hospital simply because there was no blood plasma in those days, you see. And also, your journey was very precarious. A fellow stepped on what he thought was a piece of the road. Well, it was a hole. Well, down he'd go, and over would go the stretcher, and you would be hurled into the road. And so you got so much mud and dirt into the wound that gangrene, that was the trouble.
They were frightened, they were timid. They didn't want to go back again anymore at the war. And that gave me an inkling that things weren't very pleasant out there.
We used to have a brigadier there. He used to come up in the trenches very often. And his slogan was, keep smiling and kill Bosch.
On an area of approximately 1.5 acres, I counted over 110 corpses.
You can't expect anybody to understand it, really. I mean, you pick the nearest shell hole, deepest shell hole, and arranged them in or around the hole, and then filled it in. And if it was behind the line, like the support, he generally used to take his rifle, if there was one, take the rifle and the bayonet and turn it upside down so that the butt was at the top, and you put a field card on and simply said an unknown British soldier.
If you want the old battalion, we know where they are. We know where they are. We know where they are. If you want the old battalion, we know where they are. They're hanging on the old barbed wire. We've seen them, hanging on the old barbed wire. We've seen them, hanging on the old barbed wire. We've seen them hanging on the old barbed wire.
You never smelt a dead body, have you? It turned sweet, sickly. It's worse than incense. And this chap must have been buried on the corner. And the trench had been dug practically past where he was buried. God, it was terrible. There's only two things that I've felt. That person has been buried a long time and partly nearly exposed, and the other one is the smell of fear. Fear's not a smell. Frighten you when you smell it.
what I really noticed was that after being with the young fellas in the army, we were a race apart from the civilians. You couldn't talk to the civilians about the war. You were wasting your time. They hadn't got the slightest conception of what the conditions were and so forth. So after a time, you didn't talk about it.
They were summoned from the hillside, they were called in from the glen, and the country found them ready at the sterling call for men. Let no tears add to their hardship as the soldiers pass along, and although your heart is breaking, make it sing this cheery song. Keep the home fires burning while your hearts are yearning. Though the lads are far away, they dream of home. There's a silver lining through the dark cloud shining. Turn the dark cloud inside out till the boy